Now we're going to consider the question, what is language? One of the best definitions I've seen is Mark Pagel's, where he doesn't define language as just a communication system, but he likens it to a remote control used to alter the settings of someone's brain. When you think about it, much of what language does is to try to manipulate people into seeing things a certain way, rather than just providing information. In the 1960s, Charles Hockett set out to define all the characteristics of language, which he called design features. He came up with many of these, but we're only going to look at a few in this lecture. The 8 features that we'll take a look at include cultural transmission, arbitrariness, which means that words are just symbols, productivity, which you can kind of think of as creativity, displacement, hierarchical and rule-based, metaphor and abstraction, depends on the context, and spontaneous and voluntary. Let's take a look at cultural transmission. Cultural transmission simply means that children acquire the language of their environment. As Steven Pinker says, French kids speak such good French. People don't always appreciate this idea. The pharaoh Psammetichus conducted a brutal scientific experiment in which he had a baby raised in complete isolation to see what language it would start speaking, in order to find out the mother tongue of all languages. We'll talk more about this when we get to children's language acquisition. But needless to say, the child didn't start speaking Egyptian. Language is also arbitrary. The sounds that we speak don't have to resemble in any way the things that they represent. Monkey doesn't have to sound like a monkey. An easy way to think of this is that words are symbolic. Another example is that whale is a small word for a big animal, and microorganism is just the reverse. Again, a word doesn't have to resemble the thing that it represents. Arbitrariness allows for different languages and the creation of new words, as in this Calvin and Hobbes cartoon. The exception is onomatopoeia, like meow for the sound that a cat makes. In that case, the sound does resemble the thing that it's representing. Language is also hierarchical. Ottenheimer talks about discreteness and duality of patterning, and this basically means the same thing as language being hierarchical. It just means that language builds on smaller units to make larger ones. Sounds are combined to make words, words to make sentences, sentences to make paragraphs, and so on. This hierarchy allows us to create a huge number of words. If each discrete sound that we can make had to stand for one thing, we simply wouldn't have that many words, and we'd run out of sounds to make. Hierarchy, again, allows us to create an incredible number of words and sentences that have meaning. So there are an estimated 10 to the 30th power meaningful 20-word sentences of English, but there are only 10 to the 9th power seconds in a century, which gives you an idea of the power of hierarchy. One of my favorite features of language is productivity, which is kind of like creativity. We can produce an infinite number of new sentences that have never been spoken before. We're not locked into just uttering danger or food or predator, kind of like vervet monkeys, but we can say ferocious wombats drink tea at noon and can be easily understood. Displacement is another favorite of mine, and it simply means we can communicate ideas that exist only in our imaginations. They don't have to be happening right in front of us for us to comment on them. We speak of things that are displaced in time, like the past, or geographically, in that it's happening way over there. We can express ideas that haven't yet happened and that might never happen. We can speak of things as they might be, as they should be, or as they could be. Displacement allows us to do something extremely human, lie. A fancy way of saying lying is prevaricate. Lies are alternative scenarios that occur only in our imaginations. Language is also metaphorical and abstract. We don't just talk about chairs and cars and pencils, but we liken abstract concepts, like time, to more concrete things. We say the meeting ran all morning, when in fact the meeting didn't go anywhere. Or even when you say something as mundane as, he's a pain in the butt, you're actually tapping into something that's pretty high level, at least with regard to the rest of the animal kingdom. Language also requires context. Many words don't have any meaning or much meaning without reference to other words around them. Sure, chair means chair, but what does or of mean by itself? It doesn't have a clear reference. Sure, you can come up with formal definitions, but these words tend to have huge entries in dictionaries. But in general, these words need other words in order to be understood, to have meaning. Often language requires a general context or a social context to be interpreted. It rarely stands on its own. This is the classic Amelia Bedelia problem where she interprets everything literally. Kids also have trouble interpreting language when they don't know the social context or what's expected of them. So here's some famous ambiguous sentences. Someone stepped on his trunk. It depends on whether you're talking about an elephant or you're talking about a piece of luggage. Harvey saw a man eating fish. Now, is that a man eating some fish, or is that a fish that likes human flesh? And so forth. Finally, language is spontaneous. And what I mean by that is kids, for example, don't need formal rewards in order to begin talking. We don't have to give a child an M&M every time he or she says something that can be understood. That would create a really big problem. It appears that language itself is its own reward. In fact, it can be hard to suppress language once a child acquires it. We'll discuss children and language and many of these other topics that I touched on in this lecture in more detail throughout the semester. And you can provide your own feedback and talk about your own experiences with language on these features as well.